while I was looking up your various your experiences and your background, I saw this quote from you in fact, on a NASA website, where you said you talked about your unique background. You said on one side Australian Aboriginal, on the other side Ashkenazi Jew, and you see how education is useful for social mobility. So let's bring that together. How does these backgrounds become relevant with that context of the education and social mobility?
Yeah, well, I mean, to take that story back with just one step beforehand, right? You really have to go back to World War II and the disruptive effects that had on both sides of my family, actually, because both of those families basically fled the war in Europe. And on one side, my family, so on my mother's father's side, my maternal grandfather, he went to Columbia. And, he was a child. The family went to Columbia. I shouldn't say he did, right? He didn't have any choice in this. And one thing that they stressed was that they would make enough money and that they would send their kids to America to get a good education, right? And they provided them with this opportunity that even though they really were coming from almost no wealth, that they would begin to rebuild it here in the United States. And that was an opportunity that was afforded my grandfather. He didn't really participate in that, but it was afforded to him and he was able to make the most of it. Whereas my family in Australia weren't afforded that same educational opportunity in Coober Pedy. The educational system that is prevalent in Coober Pedy is not world renowned. And in fact, it's a very low income mining community. At least it was when my father lived there. And so, they would go through these rise and falls of whenever they would find opal, they'd be doing well, right? And then otherwise they would be, close to starving. And so you can imagine that in times when you're impoverished like that, you can't really be thinking about your education, right?
Yeah.
And, it's not until, so my dad comes to the United States, has me, and then eventually needs to go home to take care of his own family and finally realizes that he can still go back to school for the first time. And so after I have my PhD is when he is also going through the process of getting his master's in film. And it's been a really fascinating experience because not only do I see this personally with both sides of my family, where access to education has built social mobility for us, I see it with the students that I work with, who are primarily first-generation students. Maybe they are the children of immigrants, or they have family members who have never gone to college. And, they can really succeed. They can get much, much better jobs in the US just by having that additional education.
Yes. Okay. Very, very interesting. And as you said you've experienced that through your progression to the PhD, and now you're working in California, working with NASA, and doing very exciting things. And your dad on the other side is doing very interesting things with his filmmaking and music, and bringing to bear his Aboriginal background. So now, what part of your life do those two backgrounds that you mentioned, how do they appear? The Ashkenazi Jewish backgrounds and the Aboriginal Australian, maybe even some Italianness. As we've said, your name is very Italian, and
right.
you were telling me earlier that some colleagues will come up to you and start speaking in Italian.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, anytime that I'm at a conference, especially international conferences, right? The first thing that anyone sees and they read is the Matteo Crismani.
Yeah.
Right. And so they walk up right away and they start speaking Italian. And I say, no, mi scusi, right? So I've been to Italy a number of times. I love it there. We have colleagues there as well. But interestingly enough, that's not the majority of my heritage. Yeah. And the majority of my heritage is actually hidden. And in a lot of cases, that's sort of reflective of the Aboriginal experience for most Australians, where, maybe they weren't even made aware because of the way that the Aboriginal roots have been sort of intentionally bred out of the population, that you may have been, people look at me and they say, well, you're a little darker perhaps, or maybe you tan really well. And they say that must be the Italian in you, right? Yeah. And of course, I don't know well enough in my own body what is the reason for the extra melanin, but there's always this something in the back of my mind because I look at my own color versus my father's color versus his mother's color, and you can just see just straight through. You're like, how could I have missed that?
Yeah. Yeah, and in your upbringing, so how then is the how do these cultures come in to creating the Matteo Crismani that we know now?
Yeah,
or do they? Is that not relevant?
Well, it's a little bit of both, right? I mean,
Mm.
I think there's interesting part of it where maybe you start off feeling very much like a mutt because you feel like you have all of these different cultures and you don't really know which one you are, which one you're not a part of. But as I've gotten, as I've gotten older, right? So we do have some cultural influence, of course, on my mother's side, and my dad finding out about that cultural influence much later obviously hindered our ability to participate in that same culture. But it's sort of the work that we're doing now in order to better understand where we come from, exactly what the people of my great grandfather were, so that we can connect to relatives that we have been basically purposefully distanced from a long time, right? So there is a self-identity, right? There's so trying to find out where you came from and who your people are, because even though we might have a nuclear family that is great at creating tradition and keeping tradition alive, where do those things come from is a question that we ask ourselves, sort of consistently.
Okay, that's interesting. And how are we conducting this type of research? Maybe is that what your father's doing through
So
his
that's what my dad is
movies?
doing, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't get to conduct any of it. I'm doing my own research on Mars here, which
yeah,
seems
yeah,
very irrelevant
yeah.
in some scales. But as far as like the personal type of things, we talk pretty often,
Mm.
right? And he tells me about the projects that he's working on and the things that he's found out. But he had this whole project on my great grandfather who they were working on trying to understand the lineage, right?
Yeah.
Of where he came from and why he chose the life path that he did.